So good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Please do take your seats. We're very tight for time in this event today. And as the moderator, I have these responsibilities of leading you through this with a smile but a strict hand. So I hope it will work. My name is Ilona Kickbush. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the director of the Global Health Center here at the Graduate Institute. And we act as a platform for important global health debates. And of course, as you know, the Sustainable Development Goals are a considerable dimension of these discussions. Because of this, we have also created a network of think tanks to accelerate implementation of the SDGs. So it's a special pleasure for us to act as hosts here for the IFPMA and for sustainability to discuss delivering on SDGs, the role of the industry in the fight against antimicrobial resistance. We could say two things. First of all, and all of you know this, but I think it's important to reiterate it, that antimicrobial resistance surely is as big a challenge as climate change. But we have not yet found the governance mechanisms to really approach it jointly in the intersectoral way that needs to be done. And therefore, of course, SDG 17 is sort of this shining light. How do all the actors who get involved here, some of them, of course, have come together in the One Health initiative, but there is so much more to be done. How do we take that forward? And because of that, AMR is also a test case for the SDGs. That is, with such an enormous problem, will we be able to muster the resources of the whole of society, public, private, civil society, every professional organizations, everyone who should be involved in this to address this problem that is critical to all of us. So this is one step along the road. You know that, and you've come here to discuss the contributions of the life science industry in combating AMR and delivering on SDG 3, but probably beyond that, if you think of it seriously. And we want to hear what actions the life science industry has already taken, where does the industry add value, and where do we need to move forward and how. So we've put together two panels for that, and we have a number of distinguished speakers. One rule in this house is we never read out the bios of the speakers. It takes too much time. That is why you always get this. And this time you even get it with a photograph, so you can double check. And so you can read the distinguished people that are here, and that will contribute in the two panel discussions. On the first panel, representatives from the life sciences industry. On the second panel, a wider group of representatives. We start with two introductions. First, we will have Thomas Cueni, the Director General of IFPMA, but also the Chair of the AMR Industry Alliance, welcoming you from their side and giving you an introduction. And then we are delighted to have a keynote speech from the World Health Organization, and Mark Sprenger, who is the Director of the AMR Secretariat, will address you and give you some indications of where the WHO stands and where it thinks other actors stand. And then, before we move into the panel discussions, we will have Denise Delaney, who is the Director of Sustainability, provide us with the key findings of the report. I hope you've all taken a copy of the report, at least one copy of the report. And then you will be able to see what it brings to the discussions. So it's my great pleasure now to ask Thomas Cueni to come and give you his welcome and his introduction.
Thank you very much to everybody. First, to Ilona Kickbush and the Global Health Center for hosting us. Second, for all of you to weather the storm and wet Geneva today and come here to the Graduate Institute. I want to make a few points of introduction on what's at stake and why we built the AMR Alliance. What's at stake, I think all of you are well informed. Already today, we have about 700,000 people per year dying from antimicrobial resistance. And we have people dying in Geneva as well as in New York, London, or developing countries. If we don't act now, this number could rise to 10 million people dying by 2050. And I'm an economist. The mind-boggling number is it could impact $100 trillion GDP global, 3.5% of GDP. Furthermore, it will push many more people into extreme poverty. The challenges for patients are twofold, because on the one hand, we know that people die from drug resistance. On the other hand, we know that actually many more people die because they don't have access to antibiotics, or they have access only to low quality or even to counterfeit antibiotics. I think the numbers clearly underline that AMR is probably the scariest and most daunting public health challenges the world is facing. Yet, and I want to be very firm on that, I don't see the sense of urgency. I don't see the outcry you have had, for instance, in tackling AIDS or Ebola, whatever. And one of the reasons, honestly, is that AMR somehow doesn't have a face. It's a silent killer. Therefore, I think together we need to join forces to make sure that the awareness is there. Ilona already referred to the importance of the SDGs and AMR, and clearly the partnership element is crucial, not just when you look at it from the private sector perspective, but when you look at it from the importance of all of us joining forces. But it goes beyond SDG 17 or the Good Health and Well-being SDG 3, because it threatens sustainable food production. Actually, the behavior of us as consumers in terms of insisting on declaration, transparency, and ideally antibiotic-free foodstuff would not be a bad way of tackling AMR. And it does require the complexity, unprecedented levels of coordination, reaching out, and coordination. It's actually quite interesting to some extent when I look at the international organizations debate, to what extent quite often the private sector is not yet involved in the debate. Therefore, from our side with the AMR Alliance, we had a meeting last week in London at Chatham House on this. I said, I am banging at the door of organizations like ISCG and others, because the private sector not only has a role to play, I think it has a crucial role to play. And in that respect, I think the AMR Alliance is something uniquely positioned because it brings together more than 100 companies and associations of a nature which I think is quite unprecedented, because you have big pharma sitting down with generic companies from India, from the US, from Europe, biotech companies and diagnostic companies. It's really a signal that we need to act and operate differently. And Alliance members have committed to tackling AMR in the broadest sense. It's not just about the industry doing research, coming hopefully up with new antibiotics. It is about reducing environmental impact. It is about implementing stewardship programs, improve access, and last but not least, invest in R&D. The report, I think, and I really recommend it to you, take your copy home, share it, tweet it, use it, is really a sign that we have made progress, but having said that, we need to be humble. There's a long way to go. Long way to go because, to be honest, I'm chair of the Alliance, but I'm also Director General of IFPMA, the Association of Research-Based Companies and Association. It is one of the most challenging innovation environments that the life science industry knows. It is challenging scientifically because the bugs have an amazing ability to adjust and to become resistant to antibiotics. It's challenging in terms of setting up clinical trials. And again, last but not least, it is challenging economically because we have to admit right now there's no viable economic case for investing in antibiotic R&D when you just look at the economics. Now, having said that, the report, and this was a pleasant surprise for us from the Alliance in the industry, does show that in 2016 alone, Alliance members invested more than $2 billion in antibiotic research and development. And we know that this is an extremely conservative estimate. Now, to be honest, $2 billion in this is by far not enough when you compare it to the potential 100 trillion economic damage. But it is 4 times as much as, according to the German government-funded BCG report, governments invest into push incentives for antibiotic AMR research. Therefore, 4 times as much as you get globally, aggregate from governments, is invested by the private sector. Now, the scary piece, and we need to be honest with each other, is this is fragile. When you go through the report, you will see that half of the responding companies say this is jeopardized. We may have to scale down, we may have to cut back, unless the world comes up with sustainable, viable new incentives. Therefore, the report really bears witness to concerns about the fragility, and I'm sure we'll talk about that in our panels. The Alliance is really unlocking new ways of thinking. We are breaking down traditional silos. We are cross-fertilization each other. We do talk about sharing surveillance data. We do talk about actually collaborative efforts. When you look into the report, every single company has collaboration, either with public, academia, or big pharma. Big pharma has collaborations left and right. And we, for instance, we do have a framework on manufacturing issues. I want to single that out because the environment quite often is neglected in debate. We also do know that we need an integrated deployment of vaccines, medicines, diagnostics, antibiotics. Because if you have vaccines, that's one of the most effective ways of tackling AMR, because you will not get new antimicrobial resistance, you prevent disease. Problem is, quite often diagnostics are more expensive than the antibiotics. Problem is actually that many antibiotics, although 6 million people die per year, estimate, because they don't have access, are so cheap that even, the most cost-effective, low-cost manufacturing generic companies are thinking about getting out or did get out of manufacturing. We want to spread the word, and we want to call on more companies to join the Alliance. We want to call on collective action. Quite a number of us last October were in Berlin, running up to the World Health Summit. Call to action. I think it's now the day to move from call to action and from talk to action. I think we as an industry, as industries, are willing to contribute. We are willing to share our knowledge, our experience, but we need support and we need dialogue with all concerned people. Thanks a lot.
Good afternoon. First of all, I would like to thank the AMR Industry Alliance for inviting WHO. And I was here a few months ago with Thomas, Nina, and others, and we were discussing this report. And in fact, we didn't have it at that moment. But I'm really impressed, and I really would like to congratulate you for developing this report. It's quite impressive. And it's good to continue the discussions how to further, let's say, develop this whole concept. Now, the WHO welcomes the continuing commitment of the AMR Industry Alliance to hold to account those companies that have expressed their public commitment to address AMR through the Industry Declaration on AMR and also the Davos Roadmap. Now, we welcome the process that has been followed by surveying members to gather data and address and to develop this report. Now, it's important that this report is also transparent. And what I have seen now, you have mentioned some companies, which is great, but I think for the future it's good to further see how you could improve transparency and also show the results per company. Now, we also note that there is a, let's say, rather low rate of return in completion of the survey, in particular from the small and medium-sized enterprises. We think that this is something that, but this is for the future, that you can further develop to get a higher, let's say, input also from these countries, because we think that they play a very important role in the preclinical stage and early clinical phase. Now, we expect that that will develop in the right direction. Now, I think you all know that WHO has released a report on the so-called priority pathogens. And the top 4 of the report of the most important pathogens are TB, tuberculosis, Acinetobacter, Pseudomonas, and Enterobacteriaceae. Now, in September, we also released the first global analysis of antibacterial clinical pipeline being developed to tackle these priority pathogens. Now, the analysis showed that the current pipeline is insufficient. Only 42 new therapeutic entities are being developed. Now, 42 looks quite impressive, but in reality, only 12 of these target the critical gram-negative pathogens, of which only 1 was classified as innovative. Now, we also know that if you have 10 promising products in phase 1, that mainly only 1 will be developed and reach the target in maybe 5, 6, 7 years. So I really agree with Thomas that it's so important to develop new antibiotics, to invest in this. We also know that this is not an easy job, and we are aware of all the difficulties in the business model. But as WHO, we would like to support these discussions and make clear to the political level how important it is to invest in this. Now, of course, we also would like to know how the industry can make sure that the new developed drugs are also accessible and affordable for the ones who need these new drugs. That's also very important for WHO. We also would like to know, and I know that there are encouraging developments, how the industry is going to handle the waste management in order to reduce the impact of the pharmaceutical runoff into environment. Now, we know that you have developed very promising initiatives, but really we would like to encourage you on that direction. Now, Ilona has mentioned the SDGs, and from the perspective of WHO, we think that it's not only the third SDG, the third one is on health, that is important, but also several others. Now, improve the first is no poverty. The poor are hit hardest by AMR. If you look at a World Bank report, you will see that the low and middle income countries will have the highest burden on AMR in the coming years, and not the developed countries. Zero hunger. Food security is at stake. If we are not able to treat livestock with effective antimicrobials, there is a food security issue. Now, the next one is clean water and sanitation. Antibiotic residues from hospitals, pharmaceutical companies, and agriculture could contaminate the water. So that's important that we pay attention to this. And at that light, I'm very pleased that the UNEP has also stepped up their, efforts on AMR and environment. And then the decent work and economic growth SDG. It's again predicted to reach 120 trillion by 2050 as cumulative costs for AMR. And last but not least, the responsible consumption and production. It's crucial to balance access, innovation, and conservation of antimicrobials to contain AMR. So it's clear that the SDGs are very closely linked to the AMR agenda. Now, I think most of you are familiar with the Global Action Plan on AMR. First of all, it's to improve awareness and understanding. We had in November our Antibiotic Awareness Week, and I can tell you that 60% more countries have participated in this campaign. We have now more than 130 countries who had actively developed a campaign for antibiotic awareness, and that's really very impressive. WHO has reached out to almost 10 million people by Facebook. Next week in Bangkok, I will present the first report on glass, and there we will show data from more than 500,000 people and show how impressive AMR is in some countries. That's really quite dramatic. Reduce the incidence of infection. We are paying a lot of attention to IPC. Actually, 2 days ago, we had a technical meeting on sepsis. Sepsis is a very complex concept, also closely related to AMR. Next one is optimize the use of antimicrobials. I have mentioned the work on the pipeline, but also the essential medicine list has been renewed, and in particular, the chapter on AMR. Maybe some of you are familiar with the 3 groups that we have created, the 3 categories, the access category, the watch, and the reserve list. And of course, last but not least, WHO would like to promote, facilitate the sustainable investment in R&D. And be sure, at every political occasion, we will advocate for R&D. So this brings me to the end of my short presentation. We can only combat AMR if we join our efforts. And that's why we are very pleased that there is an interagency coordination group on AMR. This is established by the United Nations, by the Secretary General. The united forces of all the UN agencies and also some other agency and top-notch experts. Now, next week in Bangkok, there will be a meeting of the IACG, and they will develop very important work that has been done by several subgroups. Now, I'm sure that that will result in clear recommendations in the coming year. Finally, the WHO highly appreciate the work of the AMR Industry Alliance, and I hope we can contribute, we can collaborate with you, and again, I would like to congratulate you with this really fantastic, nice, clear report. Thank you.
Sorry, I think we're not sure where we... Hi, everyone. I'm Denise Delaney from Sustainability. I think we just have a slight technical issue with, with the presentation here. Give us a moment.
I think it's like it's just come to show you the no, the clicker should be fine. Okay, cool.
There we go. Thank you. Thank you very much. Excellent. Thank you. For those who don't know us, Sustainability is a think tank and consultancy. We're in London, New York, and San Francisco. I'm a director in our London office, and we've been really pleased to be part of the work with the AMR Industry Alliance. I'll say a little bit more in a moment about the exact nature of our role, but fundamentally we're working on sustainable development outcomes very much with the lens of the SDGs these days, and very much believe in making the future the cause of the present. And we all know that antimicrobial resistance really threatens that future, and it's why we're all here today. I'd like to take you through just some of the findings. As Ilona mentioned, time certainly is tight, so I'll be keeping it brief and encourage you to read the full report that you have with you now. Here is just a snapshot of some of the findings across the 4 areas that have already been highlighted so far that the industry has reported progress against. We have research and science, and you can see some of the snapshots from the pipeline development. And you can also see the level of investment that industry has made over the last year that Thomas has highlighted as well. But appropriate use, access, and manufacturing environment are also areas that we've been working on with the industry. I'll take you through these findings in turn, so no need to try to get across them all at once. How did we do this? So I want to just highlight the process that we undertook with the Alliance, and really in taking what are broad commitments and principles from the Davos Declaration, from the industry roadmap, and translating those into tangible, specific, and measurable things, into metrics that we can track over time. So again, you can see the 4 areas here, and more specifically some of the aspects within those areas of commitment that we focused on, be it stakeholder engagement, different phases of development, etc. And all of this you can find in the report. There's several dozen metrics, in fact, that sit behind this report, and even further sub-metrics that you can derive. They're all in the appendix, should you be interested in the detail. But what's important is we then developed these metrics into a survey tool, and all Alliance members were invited to take part. We know and appreciate the feedback that response rate was somewhat limited, with 36 companies providing us with data. And it was really our analysis of that incoming data, as well as some of the other work going on with other stakeholders outside of the Alliance in terms of the context for this, that provided the first report that you see here. It's important to note that there's a context here. So we're talking about the AMR Industry Alliance, which is impressive in that it has over 100 organizations, and of that, 101 companies. That is only still a subset of the entire life sciences industry, and specifically, it's only somewhere between 30 and 40% of the global volume of antibiotics. And so part of this initiative really is to attract other committed companies to the effort itself, to better represent those markets, and also to point out that in the context of this report, unfortunately, we wouldn't extrapolate the results to the full industry alliance, nor indeed to the entire industry in this first report here. This gives you a little bit more detail about who did provide data and who's really the findings on which that this is based. The Alliance, as already been mentioned, is an inclusive effort, and we're really trying to demonstrate the progress collectively of this group, break down some of those silos that have been mentioned already, and aggregate the data to be able to demonstrate the best practice and really spur further action across the entire industry, rather than trying to look at it too siloed. However, this breakdown is important to note that we did have all large R&D pharma companies represented. We had half of the generics companies, about a third of diagnostics companies, and about a quarter of the biotechs and SMEs. Obviously, there's clearly room to improve here, and we'll be working hard over the next few years to improve that rate and be able to report on progress by a broader proportion of the alliance. It's still very much a rich source of data. In terms of research and science, this is the second time you'll see these figures. The pipeline is active, if insufficient still. 10 antibiotics that have activity against the WHO priority pathogens Mark mentioned, or the CDC urgent and serious threats. 13 vaccine candidates, which is great to see. A full 18 diagnostic tools in the works. Mentioned already, it's quite significant that the industry, and really here just a subset not only of the industry, but of indeed the responding companies. So 22, sorry, I went too ahead. Just 22 of the alliance members reported data on their financial investment for 2016, and the total of that, which is $2 billion, is quite significant, and as Thomas mentioned, significant relative to other contributions in this area. This just comes from 12 biotechs, 7 large R&D pharma companies, and 3 diagnostics companies. So it's a relatively conservative estimate of the investment made by the alliance as a whole so far. We know that investment is fragile and potentially threatened. A number of attitudinal questions revealed that this is so, and quite strikingly, half of the large pharma companies suggested that they could decrease their investment in this area if no new incentives are put into place. More broadly, we heard things from companies, for instance, that the current circumstances or their set of incentives is promising, but there's far to go, insufficient relative to the scale of the challenge, and really that now is the time to take those discussions into action, as I think we would all agree. With an inactive, if insufficient pipeline, stewardship and appropriate use become essential. And here we do see companies using a range of strategies. There's high levels of activity in collecting or supporting the collection of surveillance data, stewardship in education, either directly or collaboratively, and in terms of examining promotional activities to ensure that they're consistent with the goal of advancing stewardship. This might involve, for instance, repurposing advertising material, introducing informational brochures, or indeed removing sales-based incentives. Just to take surveillance as a deeper example here, already mentioned, efforts are fairly strong in terms of collecting important data. On the left, you'll see just the breakdown of some of the most active industries or industry subsectors. And on the right, some of the data, it may be difficult to see, but there's a whole variety of data being collected, most particularly pathogen resistances in general and resistances to products. Access. And indeed, for all the challenges of R&D and appropriate use, many around the world are still lacking access to both new and existing antibiotics, and it's a huge challenge. We're encouraged by the fact that over 3/4 of responding companies have access strategies covering all or some of their AMR relevant products. The vast majority of these, in fact, actually cover broad global registrations in low and middle income countries where we know it's a particular challenge, and also affordability, so taking income levels into account. Traditional access strategies are certainly relevant in this area, but we have uncovered a real need for antibiotic-specific measures as well. Manufacturing in the environment has already been highlighted as well. It's hugely important, and many of the companies are taking steps to ensure that they're minimizing any potential impacts negatively on the environment from antibiotic manufacturing. And leading companies are doing this not only in their internal manufacturing, but in their supply chain. So the data you can see here shows the steps being taken in terms of reviewing suppliers and putting into place oversight measures, standards, and greater transparency as regards the supply chain. One of the biggest highlights, I'd say, is actually the companies that have come together to develop a common framework for managing antibiotic discharge. And this was just developed at the end of last year. The full framework can be found in the report. And this is the result of a number of the companies sharing their knowledge, expertise, and experience to break ground in a relatively new area. So this framework sets out minimum expectations for companies' environmental programs as regards water, waste, and supply chain audits. And 2018 is a key year for them to start to implement that throughout their own manufacturing and their supply chain. So we expect to see much more in our next progress report against these efforts. Finally, this is just a really whistle-stop tour through some of the findings here. You can find obviously the full data in the report, and also on the website you can find a full suite of case studies from the companies in the Alliance, a whole 40 of them. So I encourage you to visit that. You can also search that by commitment area, industry subsector, or even by company name. So before I leave you, I just want to quickly show you, just give you some sense of what's next. So what have some of the companies in this report indicated that they expect to see, and indeed what we expect to see in the next few years. When it comes to research and science, more collaboration is essential. There is a lot of collaboration afoot, but perhaps more open innovation, greater data exchange could yield some advances. Consensus priority lists, particularly for vaccines and diagnostic tools, is essential. Some great work has been done in this regard with antibiotics, and we'd hope for similar in the other areas. A suite of incentives to really support and sustain R&D is absolutely essential. Appropriate use, mentioned already, the idea of harmonizing some of those great surveillance programs, collecting crucial data. The role of the public in increasing awareness, we know is a huge part of this puzzle. And promoting the wider use of vaccines, again, has already been highlighted here. In terms of access, we expect to see some tangible antibiotic-specific action to make strides there. Due to the very multi-stakeholder nature of access, increased dialogue to facilitate access to high-quality new as well as existing antibiotics, the diagnostic tools, the vaccines is a missing piece. And again, in terms of manufacturing the environment, we're looking forward to the implementation of the common framework, and also interested in the work that some of these companies are doing to establish science-driven and risk-based targets for discharge concentrations, which is an interesting new area. So in summary, I'd like to say, please do read the report. We're interested in your feedback and reflections. The next report would be issued in 2020, and then so over the next 2 years, I think we all have high expectations for what industry and other stakeholders will do. We very much support the call to action issued by those companies in the report itself, and hope that we have more committed companies join the Alliance, more companies provide data to report on their progress, and have more action against AMR. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Denise. I'm asking Denise to stay here and join us on the panel because we're going to have a question and answer session later. And so if there are any questions also to her, the methodology and other things related to the report, she'll be here with you. Could I ask the participants on the first panel to please join us up here on stage? The first panel is going to look at findings and good practices from the 4 commitment areas of the AMR Industry Declaration. We have Mr. Gary Cohen, who's the Executive President, Global Health, and President of the Becton Dickinson Foundation, Dr. Sanjay Kakkar, who is the CEO of Peptilogics, Dr. Bruce Altevogt, Senior Director of Science Policy and Science Advocacy from Pfizer. Dr. Denis Broun from Cipla could not join us, and so we have Susana Gonzalez from Sandoz Generics here with us, which I might add also gives us a better gender balance in this panel, something we're always very keen to have. So thank you for coming at such short notice, Susana, and we look forward to your contributions also. Just to be totally transparent, what we did initially is provide the panel participants with a set of questions that we were going to put to them. In order to ensure that you all can put your questions, I'm going to select some of those questions and just ask one question of each of them, and then open it up to you. We're a bit late. We always, overrun time and these kind of things. but I'm sure we'll move forward. I think we'll start with the biotech area with Sanjay Kakkar, and just ask him to explain what the specific added value of the biotech companies in the fight against AMR is. That might not be totally clear to everybody. Please, Sanjay.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for the invitation to participate today. So, I mean, very simply, the biotech sector is where we see, I don't think I get much argument from our large R&D pharma colleagues, but where we see the most innovation in general in the development, discovery of new therapeutic agents, but specifically in this field of tackling the antimicrobial resistance crisis. We really do see huge innovation happening at the biotech end, particularly in focusing on novel approaches, be those pharmaceutical or vaccine or antibodies. That's where we see the most effort there. And biotech companies are essentially entrepreneurial companies that are startups, spin-outs, very often from university labs, backed by venture capitalists, will work on a new mechanism of action, raise capital to do so, bring products out of that technology into preclinical development, and then seek to essentially partner. That's stereotyping, but seek to partner those products with large pharma companies as those products move into the clinic. That's a model that we certainly are working on in the antibiotic space, and I think we'll come on to the drivers of what's needed there. But I'll pause there on that front, just to give you a summary of where the biotech companies play.
Thank you, Sanjay. But could you add a little bit? I mean, it's an incredibly dynamic area, biotech. You've described it in a sense. It's about startup. It's about risking things, and it's an environment at the same time then that's very volatile in terms of AMR research, etc. Some people would even say it's a hostile environment to some extent. How would you see that ecosystem, particularly in relation to all the others here on this panel, in terms of your role and incentives for biotech to really deal with AMR?
Absolutely. So that's a critical point. Now, we've seen over the last few years a wave of new biotech companies come forward, and we're now seeing products in development that, and you've already seen the presentation from the industry report, showing that we are seeing innovation against targeted pathogens, new versions of existing compounds which do have some innovative capabilities to them. Now, how has that been enabled? Well, if we look at the market forces in antibiotics, you wouldn't have seen that on its own. You wouldn't have seen the incentives there or the dynamic to actually see those products come through. What we really need, and what we've needed, are the incentives that would change market forces to actually enable the investment and the development of those compounds. So that for biotech companies such as ourselves, where we say we're startup, we're high risk, there's a very high attrition rate, high rate of failure, we need essentially two actors or two stakeholder groups to work with us. Investors, namely venture capital investors, and big pharma partners. So when we project where they are looking for returns essentially, and they're looking for an opportunity to bring an innovative product forward, and to do so make a return in that investment. So we do need to see the market dynamics there that will enable those investments and those partnerships to move forward, and that's something we find is a huge challenge for biotech companies. We've seen some progress in the last few years with the push incentives, such as Carbex, for example, but also BARDA in the US, NIH, Wellcome Trust, etc., which has been very welcome. You've also seen this statistic of 22 responding companies having invested $2 billion in 2016, which is an underestimate. And that's driven a new wave of products. But the challenge we face now in the biotech sector is actually bringing those products from early clinical development to the market. And that's where we're absolutely lacking. We need to see the incentives at the market end, in other words, the pull incentives coming through, to be able to justify pharma companies partnering these products, and also venture capitalists to continue to fund these products, and also public market investors picking up the slack where companies continue to go forward on their own.
Thanks very much, Sanjay. Let's move on to Bruce, who is basically representing the R&D pharma. Maybe, Bruce, you also want to say a word or two to the issue that Sanjay raised, but I'd also like you to comment on this tension that exists. On the one hand, the overuse of antibiotics, on the other hand, the lack of access, the whole issue of pricing that, of course, raises its head here. So if you could give some commentary from the side of your industry in relation to the results here and where you think the way forward is.
Yeah, let me add to Sanjay's comments around the investment, because I think this is critical, and Thomas mentioned some of this in his opening remarks, but the fragility of the current investment in this space, it should not be underestimated, and we see that in the results of this survey. And without sustainable funding that will impact full life cycle investment in new antibiotics, other technologies, new vaccines, we run the risk of hitting those 2050 numbers that have been so often cited by Jim O'Neill. And so I do want to underscore the fragility of this current investment. That being said, in regards to your question around access, the report also demonstrates, I think, proactive steps that industry is taking to address access, to address appropriate use. And it's something that the pharmaceutical sector, companies like Pfizer and others, are actively engaging in, supporting, working with other key stakeholders to support appropriate use. I think there are 4 domains in which the report demonstrates areas of action in this space. Prevention, so what are we doing from an R&D standpoint around prevention, use of vaccines, role of vaccines? What are we doing for treatment, appropriate use, education, stewardship? What are we doing to support promotional activities? What are appropriate ethical ways in which we can do promotion and promote these products? And then finally, surveillance. And I'll touch on each of these really quickly, if you don't mind, really quickly. The vaccines has been highlighted. I won't go into that in great detail, but vaccines are very important to this. We need to ensure that not only are we creating new antibiotics to treat, but we must also prevent both the bacterial infections and the viral infections. Around education, we all companies support education of healthcare practitioners, of the public. We have public education campaigns, healthcare practitioner campaigns to ensure that practitioners know what is appropriate use, how to appropriately assess and ensure that the medicines are being used in a rational manner. In the report, we also talk about the promotional activities, and I'm going to read here a few of the highlights, if you don't mind, because I think they're good examples to demonstrate again the industry's commitment to acting properly, and some of the highlights in which we talk about within the report are, we talk about their examples of companies repositioning advertising materials to explain how some of their products advance stewardship, adapting and introducing new mechanisms of promotional brochures, explaining the responsible use of antibiotics. So not just pushing the product, but ensuring that as we communicate about the product, what is appropriate use of that product. Ongoing training in therapeutic areas. We again are very much engaging with the healthcare practitioners. And then removing sales-based incentives. And I think you'll see that come through in our report and future reports by other organizations about some of the proactive steps that industry has taken to ensure that we're not overly incentivizing our sales force to move forward. And then surveillance is also the last critical piece of all of this. Many of our companies collect information and data on resistance rates. We then ensure that this data is available to the public. That informs, again, both the healthcare practitioner on what is the appropriate antibiotic to be using in that area. And I think this is an area that frankly, industry can do more on. We can identify where those gaps in their surveillance are to make sure that data is available in those geographies and also explore future partnerships with other stakeholders. So thank you.
Thank you, Bruce. But how would you answer in terms of, some people would say your industry is part of the problem. You indicated, some of the elements you're trying to address in terms of the overuse and those kind of things. You hinted at the role of vaccination. But many people would say, you know, that particularly the price of antibiotics is part of that problem. And how do you respond to those kind of challenges and those kind of questions from the industry?
I think Susanna will probably have some comments here representing a generic company as well. But I think as we talk about antibiotics, we know that 95% of all antibiotics are generic. So often we aren't talking about price being a barrier. We know that more people are dying due to access problems, access to cheap medicines. So what we need to be thinking about is what is the broader way in which we can address those access issues and ensure that people both in developed countries and in developing countries have access to our medicines. I think the WHO and the leadership that Mark has provided here through the essential medicines list, where they have 3 tiers of medicine categories within the antibiotics, is an important piece as well. You know, they have the access list, the watch list, and the reserve list. Again, the access list is represented all by generic medicines. So it's a health infrastructure issue, I think, as much as it is, or even more so than a pricing issue. And until and unless we can work to strengthen and support increased infrastructure to enable that patients have access, doctors have access to diagnostics, and so forth, we aren't going to be able to tackle this problem fully.
Thank you, and that's of course a very strong link also in terms of SDG 3 and the universal health coverage debate and the health system strengthening debate. I'll turn to you straight away, Susanna, because obviously you represent the generics in this discussion. So how, despite the fact that, you know, there is this big production of generics, why are there antibiotic shortages? What role does the generic industry play here in ensuring the supply? And I guess also that a lot of the focus of discussion is frequently on the new antibiotics that we would need. But I guess there's quite a need also to continue to produce some of the older ones. Could you give us a feel for your industry and the challenges you face and how you would like to move forward?
So thank you, the organization, for having me. I last minute step in, so thank you for the invite. Shortages are, of course, a serious concern for all the generic companies and for all the companies in the AMR Alliance in general. They are a cause of resistance when a patient does not have access to the antibiotic that he needs. Of course, he will have a second option, which may not be the most indicated and may help selecting for a resistant pathogen. But it is also a multifactorial problem. It is not a problem with a single cause. It is an accumulation of causes, and each antibiotic, each shortage will have its own reason. And to address it, we need the engagement of all the stakeholders to tackle each one of those problems. So when we think, for example, about fluctuations in demand, unlike other diseases, in the infection diseases space, we have a lot of fluctuation in demand, which are caused by the natural pattern of infections, but also because of procurement mechanisms and purchasing mechanisms that place the generic company in a position of not being able to forecast what it's going to be their manufacturing costs, and then retracts the companies from investing more in new manufacturing lines and in new development of already existing compounds because of that uncertainty. So all the activities and all the dialogue with the stakeholders to increase our capacity to forecast will help managing and preventing shortages in the future. When a shortage happens, it's very important to mitigate it. And there's many things we can do to mitigate the impact on the healthcare system of that shortage. It goes from some regulatory changes that can happen, for example, accepting new pack sizes. It goes to being able to issue clinical guidelines more quickly to help physicians to choose better and save the medicine that we know that will be a shortage on. And all of it together requires a strong dialogue with the authorities on a case-by-case, on a country-level basis, so that we can work together to reduce the impact of that. When we think about old antibiotics and the importance that old antibiotics have, in all diseases, we need a range of therapeutic options. But in antibiotics, we need it even more. We need access to all the therapeutic options, include the new and the old antibiotics. When the utilization decreases and the demand for a certain antibiotic decreases, their manufacturing costs also change. And this is a process that has to be accompanied by the proper pricing mechanisms, reimbursement mechanisms, and purchasing mechanisms. And this is very important. Also, new formulations are very important to address the needs of the vulnerable populations like the children, and also sometimes the repurposing when that's the case. For generic companies to have the resources to invest in that further development requires also some specific incentives for those cases.
Thank you very much, Susanna. We'll move on to Gary, and this, of course, is about the role of diagnostics in the fight against AMR, an area that's long been neglected. And Gary, why do you think that, on the one hand, the debate sometimes neglects diagnostics, but also why is it that they are frequently underused? Is it their price? Is it the complexity? What is it that can take us forward?
Well, thank you for the question. I think you've set up the answer perfectly, because I was going to start by saying diagnostics are the Cinderella of this situation, because we're often not invited to the ball. And I want to thank the AMR Industry Alliance for inviting diagnostics this time. And Cinderella is not trying to meet the prince here. Cinderella has the capabilities to ensure that the drugs that are available are used properly. And to put it in the most clear terms, you cannot practice antimicrobial stewardship without diagnostics, because diagnostics enable you to precisely determine the cause of an infection and also to understand the resistance profile of what's causing that infection so that you can target therapy appropriately. I'm going to put this into two examples that I believe will be very clear. A patient goes into a doctor's office or a clinic with a fever. Often that'll be caused by an upper respiratory tract infection. Generally, those are viral infections. What will typically happen with that patient? The doctor or whoever's working the clinic will observe the patient and prescribe an antibiotic. In fact, the patient may be dissatisfied if they walk out of that office without a pill to take because they feel they need the treatment. But if they have a viral infection, the antibiotic's not going to do anything other than contribute to resistance. Alternatively, the patient may have had a strep infection, in which case they should be treated with antibiotics. There are tests that can be done right in the doctor's office, rapid flu tests or RSV tests that can determine, in fact, if it was a viral infection. There's also a rapid strep test that can determine if it's a bacterial infection. Those tests are not free, but they're not that expensive. And the way I think about this, let's talk about a higher income country, because this problem exists everywhere. The patient may go out for a cheeseburger and French fries after they went to the doctor's office and spend as much as it would cost to take that test. Let's talk about a more serious situation, not that that's not serious, but a patient goes into the hospital, and I'm going to speak in real terms because Thomas mentioned the face of AMR. So let me speak about this person here. Her name is Tatiana Vargas. She was a 25-year-old newlywed who came back from her honeymoon in Hawaii and was in pain and had a fever. She went into the hospital. She was misdiagnosed empirically or syndromically, meaning by visual observation, with strep, and she was put on a broad-spectrum antibiotic. That's not what she actually had. She had MRSA, MRSA, a resistant infection. What the broad-spectrum antibiotic did was kill off all her healthy bacteria that she needed to fight infection. What it didn't kill off was what was causing the infection, the resistant strain. What happens when you take a broad-spectrum antibiotic but you have a resistant strain is the resistance takes over because everything else is killed off by the antibiotic. She ended up in the intensive care unit, 2 bouts in the intensive care unit, because the first treatment regimen did not cure the infection. 2 weeks later, she was back in the ICU. We talk about costs, but just imagine the difference in cost if she was diagnosed appropriately using a type of test that's called IDAST, identification and susceptibility testing. This is what the diagnostic testing can do. Tell you the cause of infection. You can also test for the resistance profile, so you know what's causing the resistance, and you can also test for what drugs will work. Then you can precisely target the therapy. That wasn't done with her. She ended up in the ICU. A daughter of one of our associates, one of our employees in our company, 12 years old, picked up a resistant infection, C. diff, in a water park. Same circumstance happened. These are in sophisticated hospitals where this is happening, in high-income countries, where there's, of course, some cost barriers, but not what happens in low and middle-income countries. So this is truly a global problem, and the either misuse, underuse, or misunderstanding, which you mentioned, of diagnostics, is a major issue here, because what happens is people always focus on the molecule, on the therapeutic. Everyone can understand the drug. Diagnostics, microbiology, these things are a little bit more ethereal to most people. They don't understand it, and even where they have the right equipment, the way things are working in health facilities, the communication is not going back to the prescribers in time to either discontinue inappropriate therapy or start proper therapy. These are all actionable, by the way. That's all with existing technology. There's a need for new technologies as well, which I can talk about, but even today, better deployment and use of diagnostics, and we've spent a lot of time in low-income countries strengthening the laboratory systems. I can talk in specific detail, but they've been published in the Journal of Infectious Disease, what we've done to strengthen laboratory systems so the proper testing can be done in low-income countries, particularly around TB, which is responsible for about a third of all deaths associated with AMR.
Thank you very much. And you can see these diagnostic people really have a lot of passion about their Cinderella status, ready to change it. Over to you for a couple of questions so that the panelists can respond. Yes, just please, just over there, please, up there. Please try and keep relatively short so a couple of people can ask, and then I'll get back to the panel.
Great, thank you very much. Thank you for a very interesting panel. Congratulations to you on the report and on this important alliance. My name's Meg Davis, and I wanted to ask, it's great we have a gender balance, it's great that Cinderella is represented, but I don't see civil society on this panel. And I was wondering if we could address the elephants in the room, just to mix metaphors a little bit, which is intellectual property regimes and what role they may play in this issue. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, please, the gentleman in the middle there.
Coming from a clinical and a public health background, looking at whether it's TB or malaria or a surgical infection in the ward, the AMR industry seems to be very narrow-minded. I'm glad the diagnostic has come up, because I tried to bring the diagnostics and the drugs together, and it was hard going. And one is missing is you talk about vaccines, diagnostics, drugs, you're missing the public health chemical group, which is very important as well when you control diseases, especially infectious diseases and parasitic diseases. And we have some very good examples from Novartis and even Pfizer of working together to address good control of a program or disease, at the same time also helping access.
Thank you. Other questions, comments? Right at the back. Okay, yes, of course. I have this incredibly healthy staff. You know, the more events we do, the more they run around.
Garen Supham from the World Alliance Against Antibiotic Resistance and AMR Control, with the collaboration of Ilona. Thank you. Very interesting discussion. I would say that AMR is a three-legged tool, and we hear about producing new antibiotics. We hear about diagnostics, which is so important. That's one leg. The other one is what Mark brilliantly addressed, which is a question of waste and cleaning up the environment, notably with the UNEP report. The third one, which hasn't really been talked about, which is another Cinderella really, is infection control and prevention in health systems. And I was wondering if somebody on the panel would like to address that, because we have the problem of dirty injections. We have the problem of dirty healthcare. We have over 20 countries in Europe without infection prevention control. And if we don't have that, then we may miss the boat, because we could have the most wonderful antibiotics. But if our healthcare are dirty, they are dirty all over the world, then we're not going to progress. So I'd like to have your comment on that. Thank you.
Thank you. Who'd like to start? Bruce?
So I think there's a theme that we've pulled out from these three questions, and certainly the role of the public health community is first and foremost, it's critical. I mentioned the healthcare providers and was remiss in commenting on public health, and the importance of those partnerships and the partnerships with the entire health community, which I include as in public health within that, is important to address, and we look for those opportunities. You highlighted some of the opportunities that our company does in that space. It's around public education, it's around healthcare provider education, it's around healthcare infrastructure. Surveillance certainly also links in over with what and how we can partner with the public health community better to ensure the awareness. Building on that and linking over to the IP, I mean, going back to my remarks around access, I don't believe IP is the barrier here. Again, highlighting the comments that 95% of all antibiotics are generic. Those aren't medicines that are protected by intellectual property. Commenting that the essential medicines list from the WHO, their initial list of the critical antibiotics, the access ones, those are all generic medicines. What we're talking about is not a problem of intellectual property that's preventing access to the majority of the health needs. We really need to be thinking about those partnerships and how to build out the infrastructure to ensure that the health infrastructure is capable and able to support those medicines reaching the patients in need. And this is all about the patient and ensuring that the provider has the capabilities to diagnose that infection at the time in which they come into the facility and make sure that patient has the right access to the right medicine. If we can do that, those other 5% that are protected by intellectual property, we can work on those. Those are still, I think you'll see in the report, you'll see in other reports, that the intellectual property isn't the barrier, in my view, to providing the majority of the access issues that we have. We really need to be thinking about how we can, as the private sector, partner with the public sector, partner with civil society, partner with the public health community to strengthen the health infrastructure that we need to meet the needs of our patients.
Thanks. Gary, you grabbed...
I did grab the microphone because I want to thank the person sitting in the back of the room who asked about infection prevention and control. It is such a critical parameter in this. Most people won't realize when a patient goes into a hospital and ends up with a resistant infection, and if you ask where that infection come from, more likely than not, it could have come from the patient's own skin. There could have been a resistant bacteria on the skin, and when there's an invasive procedure done, something as simple as placing an IV catheter or a central line, it pushes it into the bloodstream. And therefore, proper protocols and procedures for things like using skin antisepsis before a procedure, before a needle is placed through the skin, certainly before a surgical procedure. This should be low-hanging fruit. Now, I don't want to underestimate the challenges of gaining access to things like chlorhexidine and the right antiseptics, although they generally are available, but more so the health system strengthening that enables practitioners to know what the right protocols are. You even mentioned unsafe injection. You know, back in the late 1980s, WHO and UNICEF came to industry and said disease is being spread among children in mass immunization programs as part of the EPI because the devices are being reused. And industry responded to that, developed the auto-disable immunization device, which today is about 4 cents per device. We ourselves have provided over 6 billion of those for safe immunization of children since the year 2000, wiping out that category of disease spread. So things like placement of instruments and surgical procedures and what's the proper infection prevention and control steps to be taken in those is absolutely central to combating AMR. And what makes this low-hanging fruit in a way, these are things we can do today. This doesn't require $2 billion of investment, but it does require health system strengthening, training, and access to the right products.
Sanjay?
Yes, I mean, there's an interesting theme developing, and one that I think we all in this room should support. I think we all are actors together in this global problem, and we know the scale of the issue that we're facing, and we know the challenges that we have, and we know that the solutions are multiple. We know that environmental controls, access, stewardship, and new technology are critical. Now, industry is one player in there with government, with non-governmental organizations, with civil society, and with others. And industry can provide, can certainly be part of the solution in terms of new technology. That's obviously what we've been talking about, and how that technology is deployed. But we need to see the other actors also coming together and recognizing the need over here. You know, we talked about the number of products in development, but that's just a drop in the ocean in terms of what's needed. We need multiple new mechanisms of action coming to market, and also we need those new technologies, new antibiotic products, or new mechanisms, whichever way you want to define it, on the shelf, ready to be used as and when needed, directed by all of the evolution in the way we want to treat this disease and prevent these diseases. So then the question is actually, how do those market forces, how do those drivers actually enable that to happen? And I think we are facing a critical moment right now in terms of the new technology developments, because we need to see movement on society as a whole, which industry is part of, on the pull incentive side, to be able to actually stimulate the huge order of magnitude change that we need in R&D to be able to provide one piece of the solution over here. And I think in the way those technologies come to market and the way they're deployed, we can try and address the concerns about intellectual property. That's certainly, there is an approach, and I entirely agree with what Bruce said, is that the way those pull incentives work will address the way those technologies are deployed and how societies broadly get access to them. But I think we shouldn't sort of be expecting industry to be coming up with all the solutions over here. We have to work as collaborators across the board, and I think we shouldn't make an assumption that all of the technology that needs to be developed will automatically be developed. There have to be some step changes here at a societal level to see those products come through and see that R&D happen.
Thank you. Susanna.
I would just like to finish by demonstrating or referring to the Industry Alliance as an excellent example how different silos can actually work together and have a product, which is this report, that will help us all move forward, and use that as an example of other collaborations of other organizations that also somehow tend to work in silos because of their own objectives. So congratulations to the group, and use these as an example to move forward.
Thank you. Denise, you're sitting up here. You should have a chance to say something.
Sure.
If you listen to this discussion, some of the questions, which of them were not touched on in your report? How would you perhaps like to take the report forward? What are issues that seem to be really important to you?
Thank you, Ilona. Two particular points, I'd say. The question on infection prevention and control, that's an area that there's a little bit in the report on that, and I think it's an area where we could build out perhaps further tracking and metrics and collect more information on that from industry. And perhaps more broadly, the thread here around other stakeholders and other actors. By no means is the Alliance or industry operating in a vacuum here, and there's so many other important stakeholder groups that need to work in their own right and in collaboration with industry to make progress against this. So perhaps there's an opportunity in future to actually shine more of a light on the effective collaborative initiatives that are underway. There's a bit of that in our work so far, but I think that could be an area of emphasis certainly in the future.
Thank you, Denise. Thank you to the panel. Thank you. There was reference earlier to the composition of this panel. This panel was composed according to the industries that were analyzed in the report, of course. We now move to another panel, and I'd like the participants in that panel to please join us. In this panel, we will be discussing the setting of targets for the future and identifying potential collaborations with the private sector. We have Mark Springer, who is joining us again on this panel. We have Mrs. Martha Gianza Luterot, who's the Director of Pharmaceutical Services and Chief Pharmacist of Ghana. We have Thomas Cueni, who already spoke to you. We have Dr. Manika Balasegaram, who now is the Director of Global Antibiotic Research and Development, GARD-P. And we have Cinderella, Dr. Katharina Böhme, who's the CEO, Foundation for Innovative New Diagnostics, FIND. Actually, over the weekend, because I really had to relax, I saw a new interpretation of a fairy tale. I actually saw Snow White and the Huntsman or something like that. And I was reminded, when Cinderella was put forward, because this was such a totally different interpretation of Snow White, who was fighting with a sword and, a really intense new way of looking at a female fairy tale person. So I think there's good chances for Cinderella to play a bigger role in all of this. So I'd like to start with Martha, actually, if I may, on this panel, and take the discussion to the country level. We're so pleased that you've been able to join us. And you, of course, have put a number of specific programs into place that try to change the behaviors of the different players around antimicrobial resistance. And maybe you want to share with us some of that experience, what difference it has made, how easy or difficult was it to set this up? It should work, actually. Then we would get a feeling for, how all these declarations that we've also heard about, how they are implemented at the country level. Please, Martha, do share with us your experiences.
Thank you very much. I must say that a lot of the issues we are discussing at the global level actually affect countries. And it is only when you are at the country level that you begin to appreciate some of the issues that are coming up in terms of infection prevention and control, awareness creation, surveillance, both consumption as well as laboratory surveillance, and of course, rational or responsible use of medicines and investments into the antimicrobial resistance space. In Ghana, we had what we call a platform where we call it Alliance, where we try to involve as many players in the AMR space together. And we identified key areas that we needed to change the narrative. So we developed some strategies, and one of them is to determine the knowledge, attitude, beliefs, and practices of what we already have anecdotal evidence that providers do not behave well when it comes to antibiotic resistance. And so those findings we put together into a paper, and that is available for the general good. And we felt that that should give us the basis for any intervention, because whatever you cannot measure, then it cannot be done. And therefore, we felt the evidence generation in terms of what providers are practicing, what civil society is doing regarding antimicrobial resistance, and what all the players, the environment, the veterinary, the aquaculture. And so all those evidence, or the body of evidence we now have, forms the basis for all the interventions that we are doing in Ghana. And I must say that we get along very well in terms of what has to be done. Everybody is frank regarding their area of expertise and where their failings are. WHO is very active on that platform. The OIE is very, very active on that platform. And the FAO are very, very supportive of that platform. And together, we came out with the National Action Plan, and also a policy, which has been cabinet approved. That is, the government of the Republic has approved it as a working document for all the sector ministries involved in antimicrobial resistance. I think I'll pause here, and then we can take the rest forward.
Thank you very much. We'll come back to some of these things, but we're already seeing, how important the different levels are. The stakeholders need to come together, but there needs to be strong governmental support and here even at the level of the cabinet and the government as a whole. And of course, Marta, you were also referring back to what was said in the earlier panel, the strong link into health system strengthening, ensuring universal health, the health system's role in all of this being crucial, but of course the other sectors as well. So we'll keep that in mind as we move on. I'd like to turn to Monica and ask you, here is GARD P. You know, what are the solutions you are looking for? Why are you different? Why did it need you?
Thank you very much. So just to explain, GARD P is the Global Antibiotic Research and Development Partnership. And in fact, we are a partnership between the World Health Organization and the Drugs for Neglected Diseases Initiative. And we are focused on AMR, particularly gram-negative infections. And the model of how we work is that we partner with both the public and private sector and academia with really two aspects in mind: to either accelerate the development and introduction of new chemical entities, or to improve the use of existing and old antibiotics, because we think there's quite a lot of work that can be done there. In terms of the model of how we're not simply a funder, so we're not just providing resources, financial resources to fund R&D projects. We actually work in partnership, and we try to bring different actors together in so doing. So we don't just work with the private sector, but we'll also bring together governments, academia, and other funders really to drive a project forward. And I think what is also very important is we don't just think about the fact that we need to develop a drug. We first of all think about what is the public health needs, and we develop a research and development strategy around that. We set target product profiles around that, and then we do a landscaping work and identify which are really the most promising avenues, and then build an access and stewardship strategy into that. And that also has to be a very important aspect when we actually start negotiating and talking, for instance, with companies. We are currently working in a few different areas, particularly areas of acute need. We have a memory recovery project. We are supporting some exploratory early research, but particularly in our big clinical programs, we're doing work on neonatal sepsis and pediatrics and sexually transmitted infections. And just to give you an example about why it is important to think about the public health needs, it was mentioned earlier that there are about 700,000 deaths due to drug-resistant bacterial infections. But there was another study that showed that of that basically there's 214,000 deaths in neonates from drug-resistant bacterial infections. So it's important to understand that we don't just need to develop antibiotics, we need to develop them for specific populations and target these interventions appropriately. So what we're trying to do is to work with not just old drugs, but potentially new drugs coming out of the pipeline to accelerate the neonatal development, and then identify how to best use drugs and develop new regimens that can then be recommended for use globally. I would just like to end by saying that some of the biggest challenges we face obviously is the fact that we do feel that there needs to be a big investment in antibiotic research and development, both obviously push and pull incentives. But I think in the short to medium term, a lot can also be done by a significant increase in push mechanisms and push funding. So this is important, particularly I think for areas of significant neglect. I think in the medium to long term, we do have to also think about pull mechanisms. I also think that we also have to accept that there is a challenge around access and stewardship, and it's very, very important that we keep these two aspects integrated. They're not necessarily things that come in tension with each other, I think. And in fact, I strongly encourage the Industry Alliance to really bring their working groups on access and stewardship together under one umbrella. But it's something that it is possible when we are engaging with industry partners. They have been very open and receptive towards looking at these different aspects and how we can tackle this and embed this in our research and development programs. And just to end with an example, we have actually signed an agreement with a small company to work on accelerating the development of a new drug for sexually transmitted infections. And right from the beginning, in the collaboration agreement and partnership agreement we've made with this company, we have made some decisions, including in the agreement, on how we will limit the use of this drug, what indications we develop for, and potentially where we would target its initial introduction. And I think this is something that I think we look forward to working with other partners. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Monica. Can I ask another question? There's a lot of initiatives actually now being created around AMR, which is very positive. Could you give us a bit of an idea, how did GARP come about? Who pushed for it? Who's paying for it? How big is it?
So we are relatively new. In fact, I would say the idea really came from a technical meeting that WHO held about 3 years ago that was really looking at possible ways to incentivize or support public health-driven R&D in the space of AMR. And in fact, one concept note suggested potentially looking at a product development partnership that could really focus on specific neglected priorities, and also particularly in the space of AMR. So that was where the concept was born, and then I think in a member state meeting a year later, a few member states expressed support, so we actually have some funding support from about 5 or 6 member states, but actually more than that now. But probably the biggest member state supporter is Germany, but there are other countries such as the UK, South Africa, probably shouldn't forget all of these in the list, but Switzerland and other actually smaller countries like Monaco and Luxembourg. We are talking to a range of actually different countries as well to support us. The idea was in fact to do something different. As I mentioned, we are not a funder. And like in fact some other PDPs, we are looking at, we are also partnering companies, and we are actually actively taking a role in developing the R&D strategy, but also we are taking a role in acting as a sponsor of trials, taking in fact the legal risk of doing studies, including in difficult environments, and also trying to embed particularly the kind of access and stewardship strategies in our legal agreements with companies. And so that is a different aspect, a different way of working, and probably more operational and hands-on in that respect.
Thank you, and I think it's important to highlight, where the differences are, where the innovations are. We tried a little bit of that, just like we have the startups in the private sector, we have a sort of startups experimental innovation in global health, and to actually see how did it come about, who's taking the risk, who's investing, is quite an important issue as well. I'd like to move on to Katarina, and I think some of the things Monica said, I saw you nodding, because in relation to FIND and full disclosure, I am on the board of FIND, so that's why we can joke with each other the way we do. But give us a feel for how the role FIND plays in this AMR space, how it started working in this space, and what you think it can particularly contribute, and this way of working, because the PDP approach has been very critical for FIND as well.
Sure, in a nutshell, I guess you could say FIND is trying to bring Cinderella to a happy ending. Thomas has highlighted it already, and also Mark. The majority of AMR, 80% of the AMR burden is in low middle income countries, and that's of course where diagnostic access issues are most pronounced. So FIND's role in AMR is really building out from its portfolio in tuberculosis, its work in sort of the big infectious disease killers in low middle income countries, and we've broadened our work to include fever, to include respiratory infections. And really in our recent strategy review have seen that R&D is not enough. There is some significant investments already going into early stage development, especially for diagnostics. But what we see is that diagnostic access pathway is not at all defined. We have strong data and have collected with countries over the last year strong data for simple diagnostics such as CRP. When introduced in malaria programs, they can reduce antibiotic overuse by about 40% without significant additional measures in terms of education and so forth, yet they're not in use. They're not in use because we don't have strong global and national policies. They're not in use because we have no procurement mechanisms for diagnostics. We don't have a Gavi, we don't have a global fund to procure these tests, to do joint forecasting and reduce the pricing of diagnostics, which is going to be critical. We don't see enough collaboration in the diagnostic space to promotion. We're starting to work in that space now, for example, with Becton and Dickinson to actually have patients and doctors understand the value. You know, as Martha has already highlighted, the social behavior and health systems issues in low-middle income countries are particularly remarkable in that we have an unregulated private sector in many countries, in that, you know, very simple, there is a risk for clinicians, especially in rural settings, that if they let patients go without treatment, that there is no follow-up and that these patients die. So there's a lot of incentive mechanisms that we have to jointly create. So FIND, besides working through its more traditional way of working with industries in building R&D portfolios, we're trying to play a much stronger role in catalyzing access and addressing the market failure situation, specifically in low middle income countries. We advocate for the creation of a diagnostic use accelerator and really see UNITAID, I see Sunny sitting here, and UNICEF as critical partners in this space. And we also think that such a use accelerator would be a way to engage industry and especially also pharma around creating a better case for diagnostics and getting them into use.
Thank you. I'd like to pass on to Thomas. Thomas, you gave us some indications also of the gaps that you see in this field, but as chair of the AMR Industry Alliance, you know, what is it you want to achieve in the next 5 years? What would you really want to push your own industry to do?
I think there are a number of objectives. One, to be honest, I would love to see a couple of dozen Indian companies, members of the Alliance, and maybe a couple of hundred Chinese companies, members of the Alliance. Because when you look at the gaps, the Alliance covers less than half of the volume use. And when you think about the BBC documentary about animals, antibiotics are cheap, vets are expensive, that was the theme. I think that should make us think. In terms of the Alliance, we need to continue to make progress on stewardship, access, and environmental impact. The most important element, if we really want to solve the need, address the need for new antibiotics, is really we need to move from talk to action on incentives. We are very supportive of what Monica and GARDP are doing. We think what CARB-X is doing in the US. We think that the Wellcome Trust is very important. But when you look at the numbers, the $2 billion the private sector spends right now is almost a drop in the ocean in terms of what you need. And therefore, unless we get serious about talking about how can we change the economic environment, I think we will not really make serious progress. And there, I have no problem to address the elephant in the room. Actually, patents are absolutely crucial if you want to have the private sector invest. And Sanjay actually said a lot is happening in the early stage development. I think the push incentives are great, it's happening, but then it comes to the decision point. Are you investing, $1 million, or are you investing 100 or few hundred millions to bring a new drug to the market? We did another survey in addition to sustainability where we worked with a Canadian consultancy, and the result was pretty much the risk of investing in antibiotics is pretty comparable to investing in oncology. The risk of failure, the cost, the duration, actually to some extent even bigger. But what you know is if you make this decision today, right now, you basically know that there's no money at the end of the tunnel. And therefore, you need to be pretty much, for good cause. You need to basically overcome all the normal economic rationale And you can do that up to a point, and basically that's what you see with the 2 billion invested right now. But it's not sustainable long run. What happened over the last 12 months, and I think that's an interesting development in the private sector. The private sector a year ago was all over the place when it came to discussion about incentives. We now really pulled ourselves together. We say we need to be open-minded. We can't say it's that rather than that. We need to address the problem that a number of antibiotics simply are too cheap. And that's the problem for the generics. And we need to be honest about that. On the other hand, I'm very much in favor of market entry awards. I'm in favor of looking at reimbursement reforms, but also I don't see G7 or G20, with all due respect to the great work Germany did last year on AMR, signing $10 billion checks. And if you talk about the needs, you would need probably medium term more than $10 billion checks. Therefore, we need to think about mechanisms which may defer the signing of these checks, which may be politically actually quite controversial right now. And what I know from my colleagues in the industry, we are really willing to engage on that. And we have to be upfront. We have to combine this with new approaches to solving the access problem. When you look at what happened in AIDS over the last 20 years, from treating a few thousand people in developing countries, around 2000, the industry signed joint statement of intent with Gro Brundtland and Kofi Annan. A few thousand people treated in the first 6 months or 12 months. Today, almost 20 million people treated. I'm not sure whether we will get the global fund for AMR, but we need to talk about, the funding. And I very much welcome countries like Ghana who have a national action plan. Many other countries don't have that. And we need to advocate UHC, because countries with UHC have less of a problem with AMR.
Thank you. So we go to WHO, 100 billion? Where's it going to come from?
Yes, I think a lot of money is needed, but in particular for health system strengthening, because it is not just a vertical program. We go for AMR and we will solve all the problems. If there is no pharmaceutical chain, well-trained pharmacists, well-trained vets, doctors, etc., it will never work. And I remember there was the Call for Action meeting in Berlin, and some of you have attended that. There was a workshop, maybe you were there. And I learned that in some countries you go, there's only a vet, and you go to the vet for the drugs, for your animals, but also for your family. And now from a WHO perspective, we always advocate take only antibiotics on prescription. Yeah, that's a very good message. But what I learned in, for example, Thailand, this is not always possible. And we had a workshop on behavior change because we're talking about, in fact, behavior change. And what I learned in Thailand is that a lot of people just walk to a kind of drugstore and will ask for an antibiotic because they have a sore throat. Now they put on the bench a mirror, a make-up mirror, with and then they had a torch, but they changed an old-fashioned torch for a LED torch with very good lights. You know the story? Yeah, and so people come to this drugstore and they can use that LED torch and see their throat, and then they have, kind of pictures, and then they can try to distinguish whether they need an antibiotic. Now, this sounds very simple, but it is working in some areas. And if you look in Europe, there is a fourfold difference between high-consuming countries and less consuming countries in the human sector. Sweden is very low, Germany, Netherlands. Has that to do with healthy population? No, nothing. It's about the expectation of patients. If you go as a patient to your doctor in Sweden or in my own home country, the Netherlands, you don't expect to get a prescription. You get maybe a painkiller, and only when it's really needed. If you go abroad here in France, there's a totally different culture. So what we aim to do as WHO, discuss with experts to change behavior and to educate people that they don't need to put pressure on their doctors to get antibiotics. This is one example. In vet, we know that there is more than 80-fold difference within Europe. And again, this has to do with advocating best practices of how to use antibiotics in animal sector. So there is a lot to do, but we should really realize this has to do with, in fact, also universal health coverage. Otherwise, it will never work.
Thank you. Over to you. 2, 3 questions. Yes, please. Two people over there. First, the gentleman. Equity rules.
Thank you very much. Thanks. John Bastow, Global Fund. And I've got a question about incentives, and particularly the pull incentives, which I think is the most challenging space. So I can see, for example, in the diagnostic space that incentives reward greater use, and that's good for AMR. But with pharmaceuticals, with antibiotics, part of the challenge is any kind of reward runs the risk of rewarding overuse or inappropriate use. So I'd appreciate the whole panel's comments on incentives and how you can set them up so that they positively encourage appropriate use of antibiotics and appropriate approach to AMR. Thank you.
Thank you. Just give it forward.
Thank you, Professor Bettina Borisch from the World Federation of Public Health Associations. I liked all the colleagues who said universal health coverage, public health, the link to the general systems. And I especially was interested what Dr. Marta said, that you have a political move and that you have a whole cabinet decision. So I would like to hear from whoever wants to answer how we get the political move around it, because we see it's a whole systems problem and we need the politics into it.
Thank you. 1 or 2 more? I'm taking people that haven't spoken yet. So this gentleman here and then back there.
Thank you. I just want to go back to your last intervention and just inform that in Switzerland we have a Swiss roundtable for antibiotics, the aim of which is to stimulate the innovative research on antibiotic resistance, of course. And in last November, this group has launched an appeal to the Federal Council in Switzerland, the government of Switzerland, in order to install a dialogue, a structured dialogue, especially for the incentives to be considered, because we feel this is really a very important thing, and not only the push incentives, but also and mainly the pull incentives. And for that, we are going to have 3 meetings with 3 federal councillors. Federal councillors in Switzerland are equivalent of ministers in other governments, and that means that we are going to talk with 3 different councillors, ministers out of 7 of the government. So we think we are going to progress in this field, we hope at least.
Yes, and I think we have a parliamentarian here from the Swiss Health Committee. Yes, so welcome. And thank you for the political interest in this. Thank you very much. Please, there was one person here up on the right. So, and then we go back to the panel.
Hey, thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Mirza. I just wanted to ask about how do we integrate the animal and agricultural side, in particular with the needs that this sector will have for new R&D, for vaccines, for also treatments. So if we could comment on that, thank you.
Thank you. So I'll go back to the panel. You don't need to answer, each of you, everything. But I'd like to start with Marta, and maybe you can give us an indication. How did you get that political commitment in Ghana And how did you get the others to work with you? What did you do?
Thank you very much. I think that we all came here sometime about 2015 when the Global Action Plan had been endorsed by all countries. And that moved beyond health and moved to the United Nations, whereby there is a UN political declaration to which now we have an interagency coordination group set up by the United Nations Secretary General. And I think I'm happy to see two members of the Secretariat here, Faith and Priya, if you are here, just wave to us. And so that is where the political issues, because it left ministries of health to governments. That is to say that it moved, because the UN is made up of member states, and the presidents of countries are the main players in that space. And therefore, I believe that that overarching political impetus given to AMR is something that has supported all the work that is going on now. And I believe with all my heart that this particular piece of work that we are seeing today can contribute to what the recommendation should be regarding the Interagency Coordination Committee, regarding investments, and regarding what the industry is coming or is bringing to the table. And I must congratulate industry for this actual report. It couldn't have come at a better time. And I want to urge you that this engagement must result into what we call a communiqué that you can share with the interagency group that can support us. But I also want to say that 36 out of the 101 companies, can we set targets for ourselves that by 2020 you have about 72, that is if we are very ambitious, or 80% of respondents, so that we know that everyone is getting on board, and this is your contribution towards the AMR debate. And I also want to say how we did it in Ghana. All these pieces came together because we needed to, we have seen it physically, where children or babies in neonatal clinics are dying because of MRSA that infected the ward. And we have seen our food chain has been compromised, whereby the fish we are eating has layers of resistance in them. The meat on our tables are having some levels of resistance. Our environment has some levels of antibiotics in them. And that is why, for me, the industry may have to also look at the governance, especially the environmental audit that is required to ensure that we are paying attention to the effluents getting into the environment, getting to the soil. And I believe that the bigger companies will do much. That is why we need all the other companies to come on board to ensure that we are getting it right.
One more point.
One more point. The one more point I want to say is that coming from a developing country, I believe with all my heart that the United Nations General Assembly principles regarding antibiotic or antimicrobial is very, very key. And I must say that it's not just the Cinderellas we need in stewardship. We need more than that, because in stewardship programs, without diagnostics, nothing is possible. And therefore, I believe with all my heart that we need investments in that area, but we also need investments in the health systems to ensure that we are getting value for money. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I thought it was important to give Martha a little bit more time because she's the country voice on this panel. And if we ask, how did she get all these people to work together and get the political commitment, I think just listening to her gives you part of the answer. It needs some very convincing advocates to take issues forward. So congratulations on that, Martha. Monica, push-pull?
I don't think it's an either or. I mean, I think what we need to do is to make sure that we have both push and pull incentives, and we need to align these incentives so we bring products through the pipeline. And we also need to ensure that these incentives will result in access and appropriate use of these antibiotics. I think it's also important that we also take a step back, and I think this is part of the work that WHO is doing. So, and which was explained by Mark Sprenger in the beginning, was that we need to understand what is the problem, at least from the drug development perspective, what is the problem? We've set some of the priorities, but we also need to take a view of the pipeline, look at the landscape, understand what we have in that landscape, and then look to see how we can align the incentives, I think, to correct the problems that are there. So I think that would really be, for me, the fundamental message. The one thing that I would say is that I strongly support the point that I was making, is that ultimately, whether it's push or pull, ultimately what we're talking about is a much bigger societal investment in AMR, and this needs to be focused not just on the R&D, but on multiple other areas. So it's important we ensure we don't, even though I'm an R&D advocate, we don't rob Peter to pay Paul, so to speak, because ultimately that does everyone a disservice. And very important, we make sure that I think we kind of work in a very, very collaborative space, because the resources are going to be finite, and we need to accept this.
Katarina?
I think a lot has been said about diagnostics. I just want to emphasize on John's point, incentive mechanisms, not only in terms of money, but also creating incentives for the patients, for example, to use diagnostics, right? What's the incentive right now? Or the only answer they get is, we cannot be treated with antibiotics, so what then? So, on the diagnostic side, a big area that we're exploring now, also starting to explore with WHO, is self-testing. The most frequent answer we got from our recent patient survey on AMR is from patients that we need tests that we can buy in pharmacies at low price to basically empower us to manage our own health, basically. So, apps, software apps, and self-testing diagnostics have a role to play in incentivizing patients.
Thank you. So, Mark, what would you like us to leave this meeting with? What is the message you want to give from the side of WHO, from all the initiatives that need to be taken?
Now, first of all, we can be a little bit optimistic, because if I look at the start of all the AMR, the high-level meeting, we have more than 100 countries do have a national action plan. It's not only a national action plan that you explained in Ghana that they have, with environment, etc. Almost all the national action plans are really multi-sectoral plans. We need to support the countries to implement the plan, because a plan, if you don't execute the plan, it will not help. So that's now the next phase. We have a very good collaboration with the FAO and OIE at country level. We work together and we try to move the case forward. Now, there's no silver bullet for AMR. We are now talking about, in particular, about R&D of new antibiotics, which is very important, but there are also all the other aspects like IPC, and I can't really emphasize enough how important IPC is. We have the political side, etc. And I hope that everyone will take part in this and take responsibility.
Thank you. Thomas, it's because of you that we're all here. What message do you want us to leave with?
That we have to pull ourselves together and work, and listening to Martha, I must say I'm very optimistic, because if you have a leader such as her, I agree everything she said, and that doesn't happen that often, that the industry agrees with everybody some high-level government representative says. But there are a couple of elements which I think are important. None of our incentives which we ask for, we talk about, is linking sales with incentives. We really need to get a different model here, because the industry really has come a long way since 20 years ago, where I'm sure that many of our sales reps were antibiotic pushers. And today, many of our sales reps are asked to make sure that the antibiotics are used less rather than more. And therefore, the incentives have to be decoupled from the sales, but they have to provide an economic incentive to invest. And the difference between the push incentives and the pull is the pull incentives basically reward success. They should reward success. The push incentives are very important, and I fully endorse that, but they are early stage. And there's risk if governments, subsidize industries. Look at the German solar panel industry. You can waste an awful lot of money without getting much in return. Just one point which I think is also important, because I'm human health, I'm pharma, big pharma. We are very firmly endorsing the One Health approach. And I do believe in consumer power. I do believe that, the way we go to Globus here, or Walmart, or Marks & Spencer, I honestly want to buy meat which hasn't been exposed to antibiotics, and therefore I do believe that consumers can have an impact, and therefore we really need to approach this holistically, and we need to be humble. None of us can solve it on its own.
Thank you very much. We managed to pick up on our time. We're totally punctual. So I'm very proud of that. I would like to just pick up the very last point that Thomas raised, that if we talk about the private sector and AMR, there's of course many, many different players in the private sector, and we're seeing that a whole range of food companies and distributors, supermarkets, but also fast food companies are changing their practices, are changing the way they handle meat, chicken, and other things. And probably it'll be an interesting next step to say, how does one generate that interface between consumers and the distributors and producers of much of the food that we eat, and maybe get then a really large push, not of different segments of the private sector, but also them coming together around a number of issues and really helping us take those forward. So I'd like to say thank you to all the panelists who've partly come from afar. I'd like to say thank you to you who've made your time available to come here, to those who have prepared this meeting, and we were very happy to host it, and I was very happy to be asked to moderate. So thank you very much, and act on AMR. Thank you.